Hello, this is Bobby Torres of Private Box Recording with some tips on mixing heavy vocals. In my experience, recording heavy vocals or metal vocals, it's probably one of the easiest things to record and one of the most straightforward things to record. Reason being is there aren't many variables involved. I mean, you want a fairly dry acoustic space, a nice dead room, could even be a closet. A decent microphone. Could be something as cheap as an SM58. It'll do the job just fine. A decent preamp, which can be the stock preamp in your two-channel interface or even one-channel interface, USB interface, and your DAW. That's it. That's all you need to record decent-sounding metal vocals. It really is the truth. So with that being said, when it comes to mixing heavy vocals, I noticed that the trend, or I shouldn't even say the trend, but the tendency is for people to get carried away. They overprocess. Or even in the tracking, they might track way too many layers. It's just not necessary. So without wasting any more time, I'm going to play for you the audio sample, and then we're going to dive deep into how I achieved the sound that I achieved with very few tools, very simple, straightforward tools that anyone that owns a DAW would have access to. So let's check out the audio here. So I'm going to play it from the end, or I should say I'm going to play it from the beginning of the verse straight through the chorus so you could hear all of the elements that we have to play with. So here we go. Okay, so you get the idea. It's just a simple verse straight into a very straightforward chorus. So let's take a look at the tracks that we have to work with. So, all right. Vox verse, just a single tracked vocal performance throughout the verse. And then toward the end, now also pay attention to have everything nice and marked off. This saves time during mixing, meaning I have memory locations. So I have the verse, the pre-chorus, verse, pre-chorus. So if you have to fly anything around, it just makes life way easier. So that's a great habit to get into. But anyway, I digress. As you can see, it's just a single track, right? And then at the very end here, there's just like a second track that kicks in just kind of like as a complementary track to the original. It's not a double, it's just like a second part that only happens for a very brief moment. And then when the chorus kicks in, it's double tracked. So that's it for the entire song. That is all. That is a huge contrast when you compare it to a lot of the stuff that I get sent to mix where people will quadruple. I've seen like 8 vocal tracks sometimes happening at once through every single part of the song. And my question when people send this to me, I always ask, it's like, okay, so where are your dynamics? If you have 8 vocal tracks layered throughout the entire song, how do you make a part sound bigger? What do you add, 16 vocal tracks? And the problem with that is the more tracks you add, the more blurry and mushy your vocal tone is going to be. Unless you're working with a really terrible vocalist and you have to, sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes you have to, quad track the vocals just to get them to sound heavy. But if you're working with a decent vocalist with a great natural tone, there's no reason. A single track should do just fine. So anyway, those are the tracks that we're working with. Let's look at the processing. So again, we only have 4 vocal tracks: verse, verse extra, chorus, and chorus double. All we have is a simple EQ, a compressor, a de-esser, and we have a send going off to a simple delay. That's it. There are no fancy reverbs. There are no fancy, once in a while I might use reverb as an effect. Me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of reverb. It tends to make mixes sound a little more on the amateurish side. Not that reverb's bad. I do use it. It's just I don't get carried away with it. I'd rather have my bass tone be, not bass guitar tone, but the bass vocal tone be very straightforward and fairly dry with maybe a delay that kind of like adds some extra ambience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to completely bypass all of the processing I have on the individual tracks. Oh, one other thing I want to mention here. The vocals are not bussed at all. And the reason why I don't bust the vocals, and I don't, for the most part, don't make a vocal bus, is I don't want to get carried away myself. I tend to overprocess if I bus the vocals. Guitars, it's a different story. Bass guitar, it's a different story. Drums, it might be a different story. I like to keep them going straight to the master fader because it keeps me in check and it makes me focus on what actually matters and to just focus on the actual tone of the vocal themselves and not, EQ, compress, DS on the individual tracks and then get crazy with another EQ and whatever else on the submix. So I have the vocals for the most part always being sent directly to the master fader. So that's not to say that that's wrong. I just like to keep it simple. So I'm going to bypass everything we have going on completely. So everything is bone dry. Okay, so let's take a listen to the verse vocal. Completely bone dry, no EQ, no compression, no de-essing, no ambience at all. Just straight from microphone into Pro Tools. So let's see what we got. Oh, without the music. Here we go.
To cross the line, it shows upon my back. To drown myself in a bath of content.
Okay, not bad. He naturally has a very consistent voice, which is great to work with because you don't have to get crazy with compression. There are no rules. If someone's super dynamic and they're really quiet and really loud, then you really have to compress the living crap out of the vocal track. That's just the way it is. I mean, there are people that'll tell you to not overcompress, but it's bullshit. If you have to overcompress, then overcompress. In this case, he's a naturally very consistent singer, so I'm not going to have to overcompress. But before I even compress, I'm going to EQ the vocal. I'm going to make room for the for the areas, the frequency ranges that, like for example, the kick drum eats up a lot of super low end and even the low end of the guitars and bass. You don't need that in a vocal, so we're going to completely knock all of that out. So let's see what we got. Go in here. I'm going to grab my REQ. I'm going to engage the high pass filter, and let's filter up to about 100 hertz. Now, I don't want it to sound overly thin. If you go any higher than that, that's when it starts to sound a little on the thin side, even within the context of the mix. As of right now, let's hear the vocal without the EQ.
To drown myself in a bath of content.
Now let's listen to the vocal without the EQ, or with the EQ. That was bypassed.
To drown myself in a bath.
Yeah, you can barely hear a difference, which is great. That means you're making extra headroom for the other instruments that do require that extra energy in the low frequency department. So from there, I'm gonna actually pull out a little bit of upper mid range, or I should say the upper lower mids. So I guess around the 500, 700 hertz range, because that area can become a little boxy, just in general with most instruments. But I notice when it comes to screaming, that area just always ends up sounding a little nasally. So I'm going to pull out a little 500. Let's hear that.
To drown myself in a bath of content.
Yeah, already it sounds a lot clearer. And that's the way I approach. That's my kind of like my general approach to EQing, because a lot of people will just go nuts and boost top end. And a lot of times you don't actually have to boost top end. All you have to do is just clear up the problem frequencies, which are generally the low end and sometimes the lower mids. Now, I'm not knocking it down, 15 dB. I'll do that if I have to. I'll knock it down just enough where it's clearing up the sound, but it's not taking away from the mid range, because the mid range is the meat of any sound that you listen to for the most part. That's where we, especially when you're listening on smaller speakers, when you're listening on smaller speakers, they're not reproducing super duper low frequencies. And sometimes they might not even be producing super high frequencies. So that's the meat of your mix, is the mid-range. People seem to ignore that. They pay attention to the super duper bottom and the super duper top, but you really want to focus in on your mids. And you don't want to get crazy reducing your mids or going crazy boosting your mids as well. You want to keep them fairly neutral, in my opinion. Now, if you notice, when it comes to, if you have any experience mixing screaming vocalists, you have, for the most part, you have a bunch of different types of metal vocalists, but I've noticed that you'll either have yellers or throaty kind of style vocalists, meaning like you hear a lot of like that gargly kind of sound. That's just the style of the music that you're working with. When it comes to shouty or yelly vocalists, you don't have to mess around with the top end as much. Actually, you can have some fun boosting the top end just to kind of brighten up the tone. Now, when it comes to vocalists that have that gargly kind of like throaty tone, you generally do not want to boost top end because you will just be boosting a ton of high frequencies that are going to clash with your cymbals and the top end of your guitars. So I kind of do the opposite. I kind of prefer to attenuate those frequencies. And I do not low pass them, because if I low pass them, then the vocal tone is going to become extremely dark and it's going to sound like there's a cloud or almost like a film covering your vocal. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play the vocal track and I'm going to attenuate some of the problem frequencies in the upper and in the high end. So let's check it out. Make sure I'm in the right spot.
To cross the line, it shows upon my back. To drown myself in a bath of contempt.
Okay, so here's without the EQ.
To cross the line.
Okay, here's with the EQ.
To cross the line.
Yeah, it's very subtle. But if you pay attention, you could tell it cleans up the mid frequencies where they were a little boxy before I EQ'd at all. The super duper low end is gone because we don't need it. And I also attenuated the top end, and it'll kind of smooths out the vocal a little. I'm doing the opposite of what you would think, what most people would think to do, which would be to boost top end. A lot of people get crazy boosting top end. It's not really necessary on every single instrument. In this case, it is not necessary at all. We're doing the opposite. So now, we have this vocal. This vocal happens 4 times. There are 4 vocal tracks doing in the same exact style. So I'm just going to take that EQ and simply just drag it over. Okay, so now we have the exact same EQ on every single vocal track. So from there, I like to compress. You know, I always prefer to compress after the EQ. If you compress before, you're not control. You know, like for example, like let's say you compress and then you EQ after. You might have movement, like the low frequencies might be triggering the compressor, and you do not want that. I'd rather get rid of my low frequencies than compress, so I'm only compressing the range that's actually being used within the mix, if that makes sense. So let's compress. All right, this is one of my favorite plugins, the R compressor. Let's see what it's doing. I'm going to just let the vocal track play, and I'm going to adjust.
To cross the line, it shows upon my back. To drown myself in a bath of contempt. Profound sigh.
Okay. I didn't really have to do much. Like I said, he's a very consistent vocalist. I just made sure that the threshold was low enough where I'm getting some gain reduction. Depending on the compressor you're using, sometimes you might have auto gain where it'll automatically boost the gain the more your threshold is lowered. I made sure my ratio was not too high. This is all compressor dependent. Certain compressors sound great with a super high ratio. Some compressors sound great with a lower ratio. I found that the R compressor, this is like the Waves, just their stock compressor that came with the bundle I bought back in like 2008 or whatever. I found that like a ratio of 5:1 works best. And I kind of leave it there, you know, I just set it and forget it, so to speak. And it works on most vocalists, you know, depending on who you're working with, maybe you want to adjust it. And that's it. So I'm going to take that same compressor, those same settings, and apply it to all of the vocal tracks because, again, it's the same vocalist singing the exact same style. There's no reason to tweak every single track independently unless there's a reason to. And from what I could hear, there is no reason to as of yet. So let's check this out. I'm going to take the same compressor, same plugin. That's the great thing about using plugins is that you could just duplicate them. You can't do that with hardware. Okay. And next, I'm going to de-ess. And if you're not familiar with what de-essers are, let me find my de-esser. Where is it? De-esser, here we go. What a de-esser does is it kind of ducks. And what ducking means is you're lowering you're pretty much attenuating the volume of any time there's sibilance. So like the S's, they can get a little out of control, especially after you compress the vocals. So by compressing and then de-essing, you're making your vocal more consistent, and this will eliminate any of the spikes that happens in the natural sibilances throughout the vocal performance. So I'm going to play the track.
To cross the line, it shows upon my back. To drown myself.
There you go. And it's controlling. You can even see it attenuate as soon as one of those S's comes into play throughout the performance. Now, if you overdo this, if your threshold is too low, you'll end up with an overly dark, weird vocal where you can't understand what he's saying. It almost sounds like he's a lisp or something. So for the most part, you want to just kiss the vocal, so to speak. You want it to just kick in where it's necessary. And again, I'm going to take this exact same setting and I'm going to apply it to every single one of my vocal tracks. All right, so let's hear what we got. I'm going to play it from the same spot, at least just part of the verse, and hear how this sounds.
To cross the line,
sounding pretty good. In my opinion, it's sounding a little too dark, so I'm actually going to back off on that on the high cut that we did earlier. And again, I'm going to apply it to all of my tracks. Let's hear it now. Yeah, I like that a lot better. The harshness is gone. That was naturally inherent within the track, and but it's not overly dark like it was when I played it previously. My only complaint, or my main critique right now, just listening to it, is the vocal sounds a little dry. It sounds like he needs some kind of space happening, some kind of acoustical space happening around his vocal performance. Most people, especially beginners, will just run for a reverb plugin, right? Or whatever, because that makes sense. Reverb creates a sense of space, right? But I found that delays are a little more transparent within the context of a mix. So I set up here a very basic delay. It's 180 milliseconds on the left, and I guess 220 on the right. So it's almost like a little slap delay where you don't necessarily notice it while the track is playing, but there's an added sense of depth without it sounding like a cheesy reverb plugin, if that makes sense. So this is a send effect, so I have it set up on an auxiliary track. And my verse is being sent to it. So as you could see, the level's at negative 6.8 dB. It's being sent to this track, and I have it on my main chorus vocal. Now, I do not have it on that extra little vocal that happens as like a call and response within the verse. And I don't have it on my double of the chorus because it's just not necessary. If you're already adding some kind of space to your main vocal performance, the double is there just to reinforce it, just to make that part bigger. So by adding the effect, it might just make it a little over. I guess when I mixed this originally, I didn't like it. I will test it out once, because again, there are no rules. But I found that I don't like my ambience or my delays, or even if I'm using reverb on every single vocal track, I do it on as few as possible. So let's hear how this sounds. We now have our delay on our verse vocal and our chorus vocal, or our main chorus vocal, not the double, like I said. So let's check this out. I'm going to play it halfway through the verse. There's going to be a little call and response thing that happens, and then the chorus kicks in. So let's see what we have.
To survive, I'm not from the pain. I'm still here. Each breath that comes out goes the last. My science earth. Still to suffer alone. I beg for darkness. Let me disappear beyond the siren planet. Breathing astral cries. It seems to be another sonar. Another sonar. Yeah.
So there you have it. As you could tell, with some basic techniques in EQing, compression, and a little bit of de-essing, and a little bit of that slap vocal ambience that we added, you have a pretty sweet sounding metal vocal in a pretty sweet sounding metal mix. And it did not take a lot of fancy trickery. And even the track count is extremely minimal. It's just the verse vocal with that little call and response extra thing that happens on that one phrase that he sings, and just the double throughout the chorus just to kick it up a notch. And that's all you really need. So hopefully you found this video helpful. If you have, like, comment, share, subscribe. And until next time, happy mixing.